Dangerous type of black person is a black person that doesn't know black history. It's a black person, often from a different country, migrates to the US and doesn't know black history in the American context. Doesn't know the history of the 400 years of enslavement of African Americans, segregation, Jim Crow, everything. And then so they live in this ignorant mindset that white people always have good intentions, and the black people that get killed by the police or are incarcerated are due because they're the bad black people. They are dangerous. I'm dealing with one at work right now who will literally believe anything white people say because he's from a different country and has never read black activism in history in America.
What's happening, man? What's going on? This is the importance of Black history. Um, and I say this, you know, as a black man in his 40s, as a parent, the fact that we're not teaching history to our children as much as that was taught to us, and that goes somewhere because when people think about the quote unquote lack of knowledge of self, lack of quote unquote pride, lack of identity. Really, excuse me, a lot of that comes from not teaching your children about their people's history in America. And I'm not just talking about the slavery, just slavery, and Jim Crow. No, I'm talking about Reconstruction, you know, um, inventions, um, all the towns and cities that Black people created, uh, Seminole Wars, like you know, um, the men who fought in the Civil War to win, like that type of stuff. The politicians that made sure Black America had a place in this country. Not just the deaths of the civil rights leaders, but the things that they were actually doing. You know, because when you and where all of these people are from, because a lot of times that's another thing. Like a lot of times people don't realize great Black people come from everywhere. So doesn't matter if you're from a big city or a small town. There's probably somebody that made history that's Black from that area, or has some ties to somebody great at that in history, in American history, in world history. Matter of fact, so that's a thing. Like what the woman was talking about with the coworker, that's another aspect of it because um, when Black people don't know our history, Black people here and Black people who are not from here, they have this tendency of making up. White people said this, and I like white people, so I know my history, and I know white people are great, and you're nothing. So it comes with a certain amount of disrespect because when people, because you see that with other Black people who their parents didn't tell them much about Black history. So that, and I hate to say it this way, but they became classist and religious. You know what I'm saying? So it's or sometimes classist, religious, or atheist. All of those can go together because I'm better than you other Blacks because I was raised in a different environment. So they didn't have Black people and they didn't teach us anything about Blacks. So I just know my greatness comes from me me being around white people and people with money. Yeah. And it's like, all right. So if you notice people like that, as they become adults, they have a hard time grasping with America because no matter where you're from, you still got to deal with America, and they can't deal with the realities of America, or they can't protect themselves if they're on the path of doing something great and phenomenal. They don't see they don't know the warning signs of who not to be involved with, or we've seen this play before. You should protect yourself from this happening. They're quote unquote colorblind to that. Then you have the other people who, they don't know the history, but like I said, I know my history, but I don't know yours, so I could just disrespect you. Like, oh, my people are great people, but you black people, you're nothing. It's like, oh, okay, okay. Because what winds up happening is if you're Black American, you know this. Um, the same thing I just said about people who are classist and religious and atheists is the same thing. People come from other countries and they get blindsided because they just can't deal with, the realities of America. Like, and I hate to say this, but I have to. Um, so people who are immigrants come to this country, to quote unquote make a better life for themselves. And nothing's wrong with that. But, and I hate to do this to y'all, but I gotta just be honest. Y'all talk a lot about the success stories, but y'all don't like to talk about when you have people who come from other countries and America really the realities of America really start hitting them because they're not blinded by the everything white is great ideology, or they wind up becoming drug addicts and alcoholics, and or just in some ways just becoming degenerates, or they just say, nah, I ain't with this, and go back home. That happens more than y'all want to admit to. And just part of like the Black history thing is we know this. You get what I'm saying? We understand that part. So, we kind of side eye people who can talk about all the good things that their group does, but all of a sudden they're Ray Charles and they can't see a thing when the quote unquote bad stuff or dysfunctional stuff is going on. But getting back to the history part, they say if you don't pay attention to history, if you don't know your history, if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat, repeat it and repeat the same mistakes. And what happens is you have, Black people who don't know history and they make the same mistakes other people made. And it's like, I didn't see that coming. And somebody who's uh, more knowledgeable and have a better understanding of history and know more about the history, they know the patterns and they can see things coming a mile away. And unfortunately, this is where I gotta make another statement about knowing Black history. A lot of y'all, I can tell y'all, don't actually know Black history because you have a lot of Black people who are cosplaying with their parents and family told them what Black is, or when you think of being Black, you think of being rebellious, or you know. And when I mean rebellious, just being a rebel with no cause, just rebellious for no reason. You get what I'm saying? That's not Black. But like people have this weird ideology, like y'all don't like. And I add this to it because a lot of y'all don't understand Blackness changes in different regions. you know as a person born in New Orleans has its own culture. It's its own Black culture, just like I would say, Chicago has its own culture. Houston has its own culture. Dallas has its own culture. Miami has its own culture. You get what I'm saying? New York has its own culture. L.A. has its own culture. Oakland has its own culture. You know, big towns, small towns, Omaha, St. Louis, Kansas City. Like Memphis, like Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, like Atlanta, of course. Like all these places have different cultures. The DMV, like they have different cultures. So to learn Black history, sometimes that's a thing you got to understand too. Like there's a different um, way of being Black in other places. You got the base Black experience, but people have different scenarios, whether that be because of the climate or of the culture of the city. Like it changes. So a lot of y'all, like I said, you got people cosplaying, you got people just like just be thinking like being Black is something, you have to be something negative to be Black, and that's so stupid. And that's the part about knowing history, because if you knew Black history, you would know the vast majority of our history is not degenerate. The vast majority of it, you can't even, you know, people cling to, you know, I would say 5% of our culture that could be looked at as degenerate. They can cling to that, you know, at the most 10%. And I'm not trying to be, I'm not even being biased. I'm like literally like, yeah, that's because people cling to all the other stuff because they want to have a bad view of us, a bad light of us. But the reality, if you know the history, you would know all of the great things we've done in this country. Everything, you know. But that goes with us as older people, um, being more cognizant of the fact that the younger people need to know not just where they came from, but the entirety of the Black experience that you can give them from your perspective. So I'm gonna leave it at that. You tell me what you think. Like, share, subscribe. Catch you on the next one. Peace.